pilot refuses Elon Musk on plane. He then buys the airline. The airport terminal hummed with the sounds of distant announcements, rolling luggage, and the occasional chatter of impatient passengers. Outside, a sleek Gulfstream jet sat on the tarmac, its nose tilted toward the sky, as if silently mocking the man pacing near the departure gate. Elon Musk glanced at his watch for the third time in as many minutes, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed the unfolding situation. Hydraulic line, his assistant had said over the phone less than an hour ago. The mechanic says it's not safe to fly until it's replaced. We're grounded. The words still echoed in Elon's mind, each one more frustrating than the last. He wasn't the kind of man who tolerated delays, but when it came to safety, even he knew there were no shortcuts. A faulty hydraulic line wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. What about the backup jet? Elon had asked, his voice calm but clipped. Halfway to Tokyo, his assistant had replied, a hint of panic in her tone. There's no way it can get back in time, but we've arranged a charter. It's a private jet, and it's already fueled and ready to go. Elon had nodded, curtly thanking her before heading toward the new gate. He didn't care about the details, he cared about results. And right now, the result he needed was to be on a plane to Munich within the hour. The meeting he was heading to wasn't just important. It was critical. A multi-billion-dollar deal involving Tesla's battery supply chain hinged on his presence, and he wasn't about to let a mechanical issue derail it. But as he approached the small gate leading to the tarmac, it became clear that things were far from smooth. A commotion was brewing near the jet's entrance, where a uniformed pilot stood with his arms crossed and his face set in a scowl. Behind him, the co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the pilot and a pair of gate agents who were clearly out of their depth. I don't care who he is, the pilot snapped, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the few passengers nearby. I'm not flying him. End of discussion. One of the gate agents, a young woman clutching a clipboard like it was a shield, stepped forward nervously. Captain Lewis, she said, her tone placating, this is a private charter. Mr. Musk. I know exactly who he is. Captain Lewis barked, cutting her off. His face was flushed, the veins in his neck standing out as he jabbed a finger toward the tarmac. And I'm telling you, I'm not taking him on my plane. Elon, who had been observing the scene from a few steps away, adjusted the lapels of his tailored black jacket before stepping forward. He wasn't one to linger in the background when things needed to be addressed. His expression was calm, almost detached, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made the gate agents take an instinctive step back. Is there a problem? Elon asked, his voice steady and measured. He wasn't shouting, but the authority in his tone cut through the noise like a scalpel. Captain Lewis turned to face him, his scowl deepening. The problem, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, is you. Elon raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. Me? You? The captain confirmed, crossing his arms over his chest. I've been a pilot for 30 years. I've flown everyone from CEOs to movie stars. But I draw the line at people like you. The gate agents exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. One of them stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly as she addressed the captain. Sir, Mr. Musk has already... I don't care what he's paid, the captain interrupted, his voice rising. This isn't about money. It's about principle. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. And what principle would that be? The principle, the captain said, taking a step closer, that people like you don't own the world. You think you can waltz in here, throw some cash around, and get whatever you want. Well, not on my watch. Elon's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You seem to have a lot of opinions about me, he said. Care to share where you got them? The captain's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he pointed a finger at Elon. I've read the headlines, he said. I've seen the interviews. You talk a big game about saving the planet, but at the end of the day, you're just another billionaire who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Elon considered this for a moment, his expression unreadable. And refusing to let me board the plane you're piloting? Is that your way of enforcing the rules? The captain's nostrils flared, but before he could respond, the co-pilot stepped forward, his voice low and hesitant. "Captain," he said, "maybe we should—" "No," the captain snapped, silencing him with a glare. "We're not flying him." End of story. The tension in the air was palpable now. The small crowd that had gathered watching with bated breath. A few whispered conversations broke out among the onlookers, their voices barely audible over the hum of the terminal. "Why isn't he on his own plane?" one passenger murmured, glancing at Elon with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "Doesn't he own like 5 of them?" Another passenger shrugged. "Maybe they're all in the shop," he joked, though his tone was more nervous than amused. Elon turned to the gate agents, his tone calm but firm. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. "I'd like to speak with someone who can resolve this." The young woman with the clipboard hesitated, glancing nervously between Elon and the captain. I can call my supervisor," she stammered. "But it might take a few minutes." "That's fine," Elon said. "I'll wait." Captain Lewis snorted, shaking his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You really think you can just throw your weight around and get what you want?" Elon turned back to him, his expression as calm as ever. "I don't throw weight," he said. "I apply leverage." The captain's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to come up with a response. Before he could speak, however, one of the gate agents whispered something into her radio, her expression growing more concerned by the second. "Mr. Musk," she said hesitantly, "we're working on a resolution. If you'd like to take a seat, we'll—" "I'm fine standing," Elon said, cutting her off with a small wave of his hand. His attention was still focused on the captain, who was now pacing near the gate, muttering under his breath. The commotion was far from over, and the growing crowd of onlookers only added to the tension. Elon remained calm, his hands tucked into his pockets as he waited for the situation to unfold. The stakes were high, but his patience was unshakable. Captain Lewis continued to pace near the gate, his frustration bubbling over into muttered curses and sharp glances in Elon's direction. He was like a storm cloud hovering on the edge of eruption, and the longer the standoff went on, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about protocol or airline rules. There was something personal here. "Captain," the co-pilot began again, stepping forward nervously, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Maybe we should just let him board. This isn't worth—" "Not worth it," Lewis snapped, turning on him with a glare that could cut steel. "You don't get it, do you? Guys like him think they can buy their way through anything. No accountability, no consequences. I'm not letting this one slide." The co-pilot hesitated, clearly caught between his instinct to de-escalate and his loyalty to his captain. "I get it," he said cautiously, lowering his voice so only Lewis could hear. "But this isn't the hill to die on. He's Elon Musk, for God's sake." "And that's exactly the problem," Lewis shot back, his voice low but venomous. He jabbed a finger toward Elon, who was standing a few feet away, his expression calm but his sharp eyes watching every move. "You think I don't know about him? About what he's done?" The co-pilot frowned, glancing toward Elon and then back at Lewis. "What are you talking about?" Lewis let out a bitter laugh, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of the gate agents again. "Oh, you don't know? Let me educate you." He turned toward the gathering onlookers, his frustration finally boiling over into full-blown fury. "This guy," he said, pointing directly at Elon, "isn't the genius everyone thinks he is. Sure, he builds rockets and electric cars, but at what cost?" Elon remained silent, his expression unreadable, though the faintest flicker of annoyance crossed his face as Lewis continued his tirade. "You know how many workers at Tesla say they've been overworked? How many have been injured in those so-called innovative factories?" Lewis demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "He talks about saving the planet, but he treats people like disposable parts in a machine." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered near the gate. A few people exchanged glances, while others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The gate agents shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that was spiraling out of control. And don't even get me started on SpaceX, Lewis continued, his voice rising further. You think launching satellites and rockets makes him some kind of hero? What about the environmental damage from all those launches? What about the towns he's steamrolled to build his facilities? Elon finally spoke, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Is that what this is about? He asked, tilting his head slightly. You're refusing to fly me because of headlines? Lewis let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. It's not just headlines, Musk. It's facts. It's people like you destroying everything for the sake of profit. You talk about making the world better, but all you do is leave destruction in your wake. Destruction? Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. His voice was still calm, but there was a sharpness to it now. Last I checked, we were reducing reliance on fossil fuels and opening new frontiers for humanity. But sure, let's call that destruction. Lewis stepped closer, his face inches from Elon's. And what about the workers you fired in the middle of a pandemic? Or the whistleblowers you tried to silence? Don't think I don't know about that, either. The co-pilot stepped between them, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. Captain, please, he said, his voice tense. Let's not do this here. No, Lewis snapped, his eyes blazing. He thinks he's untouchable, that he can do whatever he wants because he's got money and a couple of good PR campaigns. Well, not today. Elon crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze steady and unflinching. You're entitled to your opinions, he said, but you're also supposed to be a professional. Right now, you're just embarrassing yourself. The crowd gasped at the remark, a ripple of shock and excitement running through the onlookers. A few of them whispered to each other, their phones still aimed at the unfolding drama. Embarrassing myself? Lewis repeated, his voice shaking with rage. You don't get it, do you? You think this is about me? It's about all the people you've stepped on to get where you are. People like you don't deserve the privilege of flying with the rest of us. Elon's lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest hint of irritation flashing across his face. If I don't deserve to fly, he said evenly, why is my company building rockets that take humanity to Mars? Because you can, Lewis shot back. Not because you should. The gate agents exchanged panicked looks, clearly unsure how to proceed. One of them whispered into her radio, her voice low and urgent as she called for a supervisor to intervene. Meanwhile, a passenger near the back of the crowd spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If he's so bad, why not just let him fly and crash somewhere? Wouldn't that solve the problem? The comment drew a few nervous chuckles from the crowd, but Lewis ignored it. His focus remained locked on Elon, his face a mask of righteous indignation. You think you're above the rules, he said, his voice low but seething. But not today, not on my watch. Elon took a step forward, his presence looming despite his calm demeanor. You're making this personal, he said, and that's your mistake. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to get to Munich. The only question is whether you're going to do your job or not. Lewis clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tightening as he stared Elon down. I've already made my decision, he said coldly. You're not getting on this plane. The gate agent with the clipboard stepped forward again, her voice trembling as she tried to intervene. Captain Lewis, maybe we should wait for the supervisor. There's nothing to wait for, Lewis snapped, cutting her off. This flight isn't taking off with him on it. Elon's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something sharp and calculating. If that's your final decision, he said quietly, I hope you're prepared for the consequences. Lewis let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. What are you going to do? Buy the airline? Elon didn't answer. He simply turned to the gate agents, his tone calm but firm. Let me know when your supervisor arrives, he said. I'll be waiting. The tension in the air was palpable as the standoff continued, the crowd growing larger as more passengers stopped to watch. The situation was spiraling out of control, and it was clear that no one, not the gate agents, not the co-pilot, and certainly not Captain Lewis, was going to back down without a fight. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as more bystanders joined the scene, their curiosity piqued by the standoff between the disgruntled pilot and the man many recognized as Elon Musk. Phones were held aloft, cameras rolling, capturing every tense word and movement. The air was electric, thick with the weight of unresolved conflict. Captain Lewis, emboldened by the attention, crossed his arms and stared Elon down. The veins in his neck bulged as he leaned in closer, his voice low but biting. "Let me make something clear," he said, each word deliberate and dripping with contempt. "I don't care how many billions you have. I don't care how many rockets you've launched or electric cars you've sold. On this plane, I make the rules. And the rule is you're not flying." Elon remained calm, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His expression betrayed no emotion, but his sharp eyes never left Lewis's. "Interesting philosophy," Elon replied, his tone measured. "Do you make all your decisions based on personal grudges? Or am I just special?" "You're not special," Lewis snapped, his voice rising enough to draw another ripple of gasps from the crowd. "You're just another billionaire who thinks he can get away with anything. And I'm not playing along." "Playing along?" Elon echoed, his brow furrowing slightly. He tilted his head, studying the captain as if he were a puzzle to be solved. "I didn't realize flying on a chartered plane was a game." "It's a game to you," Lewis shot back, his face reddening. "Everything is. You waltz in here, probably expecting people to grovel because of your name, and I'm supposed to just roll over? No, not today." The gate agent, still clutching her clipboard, stepped forward timidly. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she addressed the captain. "Sir, Mr. Musk has a valid ticket for this flight. He paid for the entire charter." "I don't care," Lewis barked, cutting her off. He turned on her, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I'm the captain of this plane. I decide who flies, and I've decided he doesn't." The gate agent flinched, her cheeks flushing as she took a step back. The co-pilot stepped in again, his voice firm but uneasy. "Captain, this is getting out of hand. We're attracting too much attention." "I don't care about attention," Lewis snapped, spinning to face the co-pilot. "If you're so desperate to fly him, maybe you should find another plane. But as long as I'm in charge, he's not stepping on board." The crowd murmured louder, their whispers blending into a low hum of speculation and disbelief. A few voices rose above the din. "Is that really Elon Musk?" a woman near the back asked, squinting at the scene. "It's him," another passenger replied, holding up their phone to record. "Unreal. What's going on?" "I heard the pilot refuses to fly him," someone else chimed in. "Something about not liking billionaires." "Doesn't he have his own plane?" a skeptical voice asked. "Why is he even here?" Elon overheard the comment, and for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He turned to the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "To answer your question," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel, "my plane is grounded for repairs. I booked this charter because I need to get to Munich for an important meeting. I didn't realize I'd have to justify my presence." The blunt explanation silenced the crowd momentarily, but Captain Lewis wasn't about to let it go. "Repairs, huh?" he said, his tone mocking. "What happened? Did your luxury jet finally give out from all the press tours?" Elon turned back to Lewis, his expression unreadable. "If you're so interested in aviation," he said, his voice cool, "you should know that a cracked hydraulic line isn't something anyone should risk flying with." Lewis sneered. "I know more about aviation than you ever will, Musk. And I also know that someone like you doesn't belong in the same airspace as the rest of us." The co-pilot stepped forward again, this time with more urgency. "Captain, enough," he said firmly. "This is a chartered flight. We're obligated to honor the booking, or we're going to have a serious problem." "Oh, we already have a problem," Lewis snapped. He gestured toward the growing crowd and the gate agents, who were now whispering frantically into their radios. "You think I'm going to back down because some tech bro bought a ticket? Not a chance." The gate agent with the clipboard stepped forward again, her voice trembling. "Captain, the supervisor is on their way," she said. "Maybe we should—" "No," Lewis barked, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch again. "I don't need a supervisor to tell me what's right. Elon's gaze flicked to the gate agent, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. "You're just doing your job," he said calmly. "I appreciate that. But clearly, the problem here isn't you." The gate agent nodded hesitantly, her cheeks still flushed. "Thank you, Mr. Musk," she murmured, casting a nervous glance at Lewis. Lewis let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Playing the nice guy, huh? Trying to win everyone over with your charm." Elon turned back to him, his expression hardening. "I don't need to win anyone over," he said. "This isn't about charm. It's about getting where I need to be. And unless you're planning to personally refund my charter fee, I suggest you reconsider your stance." Lewis stepped closer, his face inches from Elon's. "Or what?" he challenged, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can bully me? Go ahead. Try." Elon didn't flinch. He held Lewis's gaze, his voice steady and measured. "I don't need to bully you," he said, "but actions have consequences. That's something I'd expect a man in your position to understand." The tension between them was suffocating now, the air crackling with the weight of their standoff. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still trained on the scene. The gate agents looked ready to bolt, their faces pale with stress. Finally, the faint chime of a radio interrupted the silence, followed by a voice crackling through. "This is Supervisor Daniels. I'm en route to Gate 7. ETA 2 minutes. The gate agent holding the radio exhaled shakily, relief washing over her face. "The supervisor will handle this," she said quietly, mostly to herself. But the resolution was still far away. Captain Lewis remained defiant, his jaw set and his fists clenched as he stared Elon down. And Elon, calm and composed as ever, stood his ground, his sharp eyes watching every move with quiet intensity. The crowd murmured again, the low hum of speculation growing louder as they waited to see who would break first. But neither man was willing to back down, and the tension only continued to build. The hum of the crowd grew louder, now a symphony of murmured speculation and the occasional gasp as the tension near Gate 7 continued to escalate. The situation, initially a disagreement between two men, was now an outright spectacle. More passengers had gathered, their faces pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the tarmac, while others openly recorded the standoff from the sidelines. "Is this for real?" a voice from the crowd whispered. "Why won't the pilot just let him board?" "He's Elon Musk," another person hissed. "Why would you pick a fight with him? That guy could buy the airline if he wanted to." "Maybe that's the point," someone muttered back. "Guy probably hates billionaires." The sound of the airport supervisor's radio crackling nearby cut through the noise, but Captain Lewis remained unmoved. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his stance firm and unyielding as he stared Elon down. Even as the gate agent shuffled nervously and murmured updates about the supervisor's imminent arrival, Lewis didn't so much as glance in her direction. "You know," Elon said finally, breaking the tense silence between them. His voice was calm, almost casual, but there was an undercurrent of steel in his tone. "This isn't just about you anymore." Lewis scoffed, the corner of his mouth curling into a sneer. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elon's sharp gaze swept over the gathered crowd, the flashing phones, the whispers rippling through the terminal like wildfire. "Look around," he said. "You've turned this into a circus. Cameras everywhere, people recording every word. Whatever you think you're proving, it's not going to end the way you think it will." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Lewis's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual defiance. "You think I care what they post online?" he shot back. "Let them record. Let the whole world see. I'm not going to let you bully me into giving you what you want." "Bully you?" Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. His lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at the corners. "You're the one refusing to do your job because of some personal vendetta. If anyone's being a bully, it's you." The co-pilot, who had been standing silently at Lewis's side, stepped forward again, his voice low but urgent. "Captain, maybe we should just let it go," he said. "This is spiraling out of control." "I'm not letting it go," Lewis snapped, his voice rising enough to draw more attention. He turned on the co-pilot, his face reddening with anger. "And if you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who should sit this flight out." The co-pilot's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the crowd and then back to Lewis. "You're not being rational," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "This isn't about the plane anymore. It's about you making this personal." Lewis jabbed a finger in the co-pilot's direction. "Don't lecture me about what's personal," he growled. "You don't know what you're talking about." Elon watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. But as the co-pilot opened his mouth to respond, the faint chime of the PA system interrupted him. "Attention passengers," the voice announced, calm and composed despite the chaos below. "Gate 7 is temporarily closed due to unforeseen circumstances. Please await further updates." The crowd groaned audibly, the announcement confirming what many had already suspected, that the flight wasn't leaving anytime soon. A few people muttered complaints, but most stayed where they were, clearly unwilling to miss the next chapter of the unfolding drama. Lewis let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he turned back to Elon. "There you have it," he said, gesturing toward the gate. "No flight, no plane. You can pack up your billions and find another way to Munich." Elon didn't respond immediately. He stood still, his hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning the scene as though assessing every piece of the puzzle. Finally, he turned to the gate agent, his voice calm but firm. "Where's your supervisor?" The young woman hesitated, glancing nervously at Lewis before responding. "He's on his way," she said quietly. "Should be here any second." "Good," Elon said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lewis's sneer returned, his confidence bolstered by the delay. "You think the supervisor's going to take your side?" he taunted. "You really think money's going to fix this?" "It usually does," Elon replied evenly, his gaze flicking briefly to Lewis before returning to the gate agent. "But this isn't about money. It's about principle. Your captain here is refusing to honor a legitimate booking, and I'd like to know why." Lewis stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I already told you why," he said through gritted teeth. "Because I'm not flying you. End of story." Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but inquisitive. "And why is that, exactly? Because you don't like billionaires? Because you've read some articles that paint me as the bad guy? Or is it something else?" Lewis hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He glanced at the crowd, the flashing phones, the murmured whispers, and for a brief moment, his defiance wavered. But then he straightened his shoulders, his jaw tightening as he glared at Elon. "You're not a hero," he said, his voice low but filled with venom. "You pretend to be this visionary, this savior of the planet, but all you care about is yourself. You build rockets and cars and factories, but you don't care who gets crushed in the process." Elon raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. "That's quite the speech," he said, "but it doesn't answer my question. Why won't you let me on the plane?" Lewis's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he pointed a finger at Elon, his voice rising enough to echo through the terminal. "Because people like you don't deserve to fly." The crowd gasped audibly, the outburst sending a ripple of shock through the onlookers. Even the gate agents seemed taken aback, their eyes widening as they exchanged nervous glances. Elon remained calm, his expression unreadable as he studied Lewis. "That's an interesting perspective," he said quietly, "but I don't think the FAA would agree." Lewis let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "The FAA?" he repeated mockingly. "You think they care? You think anyone cares about your little tantrum?" Before Elon could respond, the gate agent's radio crackled to life again, the supervisor's voice calm but firm. "This is Daniels. I'm at gate 7 now." The gate agent visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping as she turned toward the terminal entrance. "The supervisor's here," she said, her voice filled with relief. "He'll sort this out." But as the supervisor stepped into view, his expression stern and his eyes scanning the scene, it was clear that the situation was far from over. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and neither Elon nor Lewis showed any sign of backing down. The crowd watched in silence, their anticipation building as the confrontation reached its boiling point. Supervisor Daniels approached the scene with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who had seen his fair share of airport chaos. His neatly pressed uniform and silver badge gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, lending him an air of authority that silenced the murmuring crowd as he arrived. Daniel's sharp eyes darted between Elon, Captain Lewis, and the crowd of passengers, clearly sizing up the situation in seconds. "Captain Lewis," Daniel said. His voice clipped as he nodded toward the disgruntled pilot. "What's going on here?" Lewis straightened, his chest puffing out slightly as he gestured toward Elon. "What's going on," he said, his tone brimming with self-righteousness, "is that this man is attempting to board my plane, and I've refused." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Your plane? Captain, last I checked, this was a chartered flight." "That's right," Lewis snapped. "And as the captain, I have the final say on who flies. And I say he doesn't." Daniels glanced at Elon, who stood a few feet away, his hands still casually tucked into his pockets. Elon's expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze as he watched the conversation unfold. "Mr. Musk," Daniels said, turning to address him. "I'm Supervisor Daniels. I understand there's been some kind of disagreement." "Disagreement is one way to put it," Elon replied, his voice measured. "I booked this charter for an urgent trip to Munich. I paid in full, I arrived on time, and I expected to board without issue. Instead, your captain has decided to deny me entry based on... well, I'm not entirely sure what..." Daniels turned back to Lewis, his brow furrowing slightly. "Captain, is there a valid reason for denying Mr. Musk boarding privileges? Something related to safety or operational concerns?" Lewis hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the crowd, which had grown even larger now that the supervisor was involved. Phones were still pointed in every direction, the onlookers whispering excitedly as they waited to see how the standoff would unfold. "It's not about safety," Lewis said finally, his voice low but firm. "It's about principle." Daniels blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Principle?" he repeated. "Captain, this is a business transaction. Mr. Musk has fulfilled his obligations as a passenger. Unless there's a legitimate reason to deny him boarding, I'm afraid he's a liability," Lewis interrupted, his voice rising enough to make the crowd flinch. "You don't get it, Daniels. People like him think they own the world. They think they can do whatever they want and we just have to roll over and let them." "Well, I'm not doing it." Daniels sighed heavily, rubbing his temple with one hand as he glanced at Elon, who remained silent, watching the exchange with an air of detached curiosity. "Captain," Daniels said, his tone low and measured, "I need you to be very clear about this. Are you refusing to operate this flight if Mr. Musk is on board?" Lewis's face flushed, his fists clenching at his sides. "That's exactly what I'm saying," he said through gritted teeth. "If he's on the manifest, I'm not flying." Daniels turned to Elon again, his face betraying the slightest hint of exasperation. "Mr. Musk, would you be willing to wait while we arrange an alternate flight? I understand this is inconvenient, but..." "No," Elon said simply, cutting Daniels off. His tone was calm, but the finality in his voice was unmistakable. "I chartered this flight because I needed to be in Munich as quickly as possible. Rearranging isn't an option." Daniels nodded slowly, clearly weighing his options. "Understood," he said. "In that case, I'll need a moment to speak with the captain privately." "Take all the time you need," Elon replied, gesturing toward the gate with a faint smile. "I'm not going anywhere." Daniels motioned for Lewis to step aside, the two of them retreating to a corner of the gate area where their hushed voices wouldn't carry to the crowd. The co-pilot, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted nervously as he glanced between Elon and the gathered passengers. "What do you think they're saying?" someone in the crowd whispered. "Probably begging the pilot to back down," another voice replied. "He's making a fool of himself, or they're trying to kick Musk out," someone else said. No way they're letting this guy run the show. Elon ignored the chatter, his sharp eyes fixed on Daniels and Lewis as they spoke in hurried whispers. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The tension in Lewis's body language and the frustrated gestures from Daniels told him everything he needed to know. After several long minutes, Daniels returned, his expression grim but resolute. "Mr. Musk," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I've spoken with Captain Lewis. He remains adamant that he will not operate this flight with you on board." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mix of disbelief and excitement rippling through the onlookers. Elon raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. "And what's your decision?" Daniels hesitated, glancing at the crowd and then back at Elon. "We're exploring alternative options," he said carefully. "In the meantime, I'd ask for your patience as we work to resolve this." "Alternative options," Elon repeated, his voice calm but sharp. "Let me save you some time. There's no alternative option. Either I board this flight, or your airline faces the consequences." Daniels' expression tightened, his professional demeanor cracking slightly under the weight of Elon's words. "Mr. Musk, threats aren't going to—" "It's not a threat," Elon interrupted, his tone cool. "It's a promise. You're running a business, Supervisor Daniels. So am I. And in business, actions have consequences." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Lewis stormed back over, his face red with anger. "I don't care what you decide," he shouted, his voice echoing through the terminal. "I'm not flying him. End of story." The crowd gasped audibly, the sudden outburst sending a ripple of shock through the onlookers. Even Daniels seemed taken aback, his eyes widening as he turned to Lewis. "Captain, that's enough," Daniels said sharply. "You're making this situation worse." "I don't care," Lewis snapped. "Let him buy another plane. Let him build a rocket to Munich for all I care. But he's not getting on mine." Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady as he addressed Lewis directly. "You might want to be careful what you wish for," he said quietly. "You never know who might take you up on it." The cryptic remark hung in the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording as the confrontation reached a boiling point. Elon remained composed, his hands still tucked into his pockets as he studied the enraged pilot. His expression betrayed nothing, but his sharp eyes flicked between Lewis, Supervisor Daniels, and the growing crowd with the precision of a man calculating his next move. Daniels turned to Lewis, his face pale with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Captain, step aside," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll handle this internally. You've made your position clear, but this is no longer your decision to make." Lewis wheeled on Daniels, his fists clenched and his face flushed. "You're not taking my authority away," he spat. "I'm the captain of that plane, and I decide who flies. And I decide if you're still the captain." Daniels shot back, his voice rising slightly. The authority in his tone was unmistakable now, and for the first time, the crowd began to sense that the tide was turning. "This is a chartered flight. Mr. Musk has fulfilled his contractual obligations. Your personal opinions are irrelevant." Lewis opened his mouth to respond, but his words were drowned out by a sudden, sharp voice from the crowd. "Hey, is that the FAA?" someone called, pointing toward the far end of the terminal. All eyes turned toward the approaching figures. Two uniformed men with badges clipped to their belts, their faces set in stern, professional expressions. The crowd parted instinctively, their whispers turning to hushed murmurs as the men strode toward the scene with the unmistakable air of federal authority. "Who called them?" a woman in the crowd whispered. "I think it was the airline," someone replied. "This has gotten way out of hand." The FAA officials stopped a few feet away, their sharp eyes scanning the tense standoff. One of them stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced precision. "What's going on here?" Daniels stepped forward, his demeanor shifting instantly into professional mode. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but urgent. "There's been a misunderstanding regarding this flight. We're working to resolve it." The official's gaze flicked to Elon, then to Captain Lewis, who stood rigidly beside him, his jaw clenched and his eyes blazing with defiance. "And you are?" the official asked, addressing Elon directly. "Elon Musk," he replied simply, his voice steady. "I chartered this flight. I've been denied boarding by the captain." The official's brow furrowed, his gaze snapping to Lewis. "Captain, is this true?" Lewis hesitated, his fists tightening at his sides. "I have the right to refuse any passenger I deem unfit to fly," he said finally, his voice brimming with defiance. "That's my prerogative as captain. And on what grounds have you deemed Mr. Musk unfit to fly?" the official asked, his tone sharp and unyielding. Lewis faltered, the question hitting him like a blow. His eyes darted toward the crowd, the flashing phones, the murmurs of disbelief spreading through the onlookers. "It's a matter of principle," he said weakly, his voice barely audible. The official's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Captain, refusing a passenger on a chartered flight without legitimate grounds is a violation of FAA regulations. If you can't provide a valid reason, you're in breach of your responsibilities." "I don't care about regulations," Lewis exploded, his voice cracking as he threw his hands in the air. "This isn't about rules. It's about standing up to people like him." The crowd gasped audibly, the raw emotion in Lewis's outburst sending a ripple of shock through the gathered onlookers. Even Daniels looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The FAA official didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Lewis, his tone cold and unyielding. "Captain, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Hand over your credentials and step away from the flight." Lewis froze, his face draining of color as the weight of the official's words sank in. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You can't take my plane." "It's not your plane," the official replied sharply. "And you've left us no choice." The co-pilot, who had been standing silently beside Lewis, stepped forward cautiously. "I can take over," he said quietly. "I'm fully qualified to captain the flight." Daniels nodded, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. "Do it," he said, "and get this flight ready for departure." As the co-pilot turned to head toward the plane, Lewis's composure finally cracked. "You're all cowards," he shouted, his voice breaking as he pointed an accusing finger at Elon. "This is his fault. He thinks he can buy his way through everything, and you're letting him." Elon didn't respond immediately. He stood still, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but unreadable as he watched Lewis unravel. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but cutting. "I didn't buy my way through anything," he said, "but I've built enough to know that people like you are the reason things fall apart." The words hit Lewis like a slap, his face contorting with rage. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged toward Elon, his hands outstretched. The crowd gasped in unison, the tension exploding into chaos as the FAA officials and airport security sprang into action. It happened in seconds. Lewis's hands barely brushed Elon's jacket before two security guards grabbed him, pinning his arms behind his back as he thrashed and shouted incoherently. "You think you've won?" he screamed, his voice hoarse with desperation. "You haven't won anything." The guards hauled him away, his shouts fading into the background as the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs. Phones flashed, voices rose, and the tension that had gripped the terminal for so long finally began to dissipate. Elon adjusted his jacket, his expression calm as ever as he turned to Daniels. "Is the flight ready?" he asked simply. Daniels hesitated, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "It will be in a few minutes," he said. "We just need to." "Good," Elon said, cutting him off. "Let me know when it's time to board." With that, he turned away, leaving Daniels, the FAA officials, and the stunned crowd in his wake. The tension might have broken, but the consequences of the confrontation were just beginning to unfold. As the airport security guards dragged Captain Lewis away, his shouts of defiance echoed down the terminal, a cacophony of rage and humiliation that was met with stunned silence from the gathered crowd. Phones remained raised, capturing every second of the dramatic fallout, and whispers rippled through the onlookers like a rising tide. He actually attacked Elon Musk, someone murmured in disbelief. That guy just threw away his entire career. Did you see Elon's face? Another voice chimed in. He didn't even flinch. Cool as ice. Elon stood near the gate, his hands still tucked into his pockets, his expression calm and unreadable. To the untrained eye, he appeared unaffected, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He wasn't angry, he was focused. Supervisor Daniels approached cautiously, his face pale and his hands trembling as he clutched his clipboard like a lifeline. "Mr. Musk," he began, his voice tight with nervous energy, "I want to personally apologize for everything that's happened here today. Captain Lewis's actions were completely unacceptable, and I assure you that this incident will be dealt with swiftly and severely." Elon turned to face Daniels, his sharp gaze locking onto the man like a laser. "Dealt with?" he repeated, his tone calm but edged with steel. "How exactly do you plan to deal with it?" Daniels hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him like a physical force. "Well," he stammered, "Captain Lewis has already been relieved of duty, effective immediately. He'll face disciplinary action from both the airline and the FAA, and I imagine his career as a pilot is over." Elon nodded slowly, his expression betraying no emotion. "That's a start," he said. "But it's not enough." Daniels blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Not enough." Elon gestured toward the crowd, where passengers and onlookers continued to murmur and record, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about everyone here. Your captain didn't just refuse to fly me. He turned this entire situation into a spectacle. He embarrassed your airline, endangered your reputation, and disrupted the travel plans of every passenger on this flight. And now, thanks to all those phones, the entire world is watching." Daniels swallowed hard, his face paling further as the implications of Elon's words sank in. "I understand," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'll do everything in my power to make this right." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying Daniels with a piercing gaze that made the supervisor squirm. "Making it right," he said, "means more than just firing one rogue captain. It means ensuring that something like this never happens again." Daniels nodded quickly, eager to appease. "Of course," he said. "We'll review our policies, retrain our staff." "That's not what I mean," Elon interrupted, his voice sharp but calm. "What I mean is systemic change, accountability, leadership that actually understands what it means to run an airline." Daniels froze, his eyes widening as he processed the implications of Elon's words. "Mr. Musk," he said cautiously, "are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Elon said, cutting him off. "I'm stating a fact. This airline needs new leadership. Leadership that prioritizes professionalism, efficiency, and respect for its passengers." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Elon's statement hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Meanwhile, the co-pilot, who had taken over as acting captain, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Musk," he said, his voice low but steady, "the plane is ready for boarding. If you're still willing, we can depart within the next 15 minutes. Elon turned to the co-pilot, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate your professionalism." The co-pilot nodded, clearly relieved to have diffused some of the tension. "It's the least I can do," he said. "After everything that's happened, I just want to get this flight in the air." Elon nodded again, then turned back to Daniels. "I'll board the plane," he said. "But this conversation isn't over." Daniels nodded quickly, his face pale and his posture stiff. "Understood," he said. "We'll follow up as soon as you're back on the ground." Elon didn't respond. Instead, he turned and strode toward the gate, his movements purposeful and confident. The crowd parted for him instinctively, their whispers growing louder as he passed. "He's still getting on the plane," someone murmured. "Of course he is. He's Elon Musk." "What do you think he meant about new leadership?" another voice asked. "Do you think he's going to buy the airline?" someone finished, their tone half joking, half awed. "It's Elon Musk. Of course he's going to buy the airline." As Elon reached the gate, he paused and turned back to address the crowd. His voice was calm but carried enough weight to silence the murmurs instantly. "I apologize for the disruption," he said, his tone sincere. "Thank you for your patience." With that, he stepped through the gate and onto the waiting plane, leaving the chaos of the terminal behind. Hours later, at 30,000 feet, Elon sat in the first-class cabin, his laptop open as he reviewed the details of the upcoming meeting. But his mind wasn't entirely focused on the spreadsheets and proposals in front of him. A new idea was taking shape, one that had been sparked by the events at the terminal. He glanced out the window, his sharp eyes taking in the endless expanse of sky and clouds. The airline had failed him, but in doing so, it had also presented him with an opportunity. An opportunity to innovate, to disrupt, to create something better. When the plane touched down in Munich, Elon wasted no time. As soon as he cleared customs, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Kimball," he said, addressing his brother and trusted business partner, "I need you to start running numbers on commercial airlines. Valuations, market trends, acquisition opportunities. Everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Kimball responded. "Why?" he asked, his tone curious but cautious. "Because," Elon said, his voice calm but resolute, "it's time to build something better, something that works." Kimball let out a low whistle. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Elon replied. "Let's get started."